it's Kay from Crafting with Kay. How are we all doing? So welcome to my new segment called The Reading Nook. I reached out to an excellent author called Sharon Hannaford, and she gladly gave me permission to read her Hellcat series to you. She's one of my top 2 favourite authors of all time. I have a couple of mugs, so fill up a cup and drink and join us for the project. So, what perfect diamond painting to use? The little dragon, reading a book, drinking a drink, cozying up for the night, ready to breathe for the evening. So grab a project, grab a drink, and listen along. Just a heads up, I'm not the best at reading out loud, so I will probably butcher some names, but please, I will get there in the end. Either way, I hope you enjoy this new segment. Take care, guys. Enjoy! Chapter 6. Julius sighed and threw down the pen onto his paper-strewn desk. It was pointless trying to even pretend to get any work done while she lay unconscious on the chase lounge across the room from him. He was confident she would start to come round in the next few minutes anyway, so he needed to be ready when she did. They'd needed to give her another dose of tranquilizer on the trip, as she had started to come round too quickly. She was going to be like a cornered lioness when she woke up, cagey, mistrustful, and more likely to attack him than listen to him. He deliberately put her in his office rather than one of his many spare bedrooms, hoping she would feel far less threatened in a business-like surrounding. He was relieved that Jonathan, his resident doctor, had been at the estate when they came in with her. Jonathan had been able to put her shoulder back into place with relative ease while she was still unconscious. They'd bound her ribs, which Jonathan suspected were broken, and stitched up the bite wound. The doctor was reasonably certain that she had a fractured collarbone too, but it didn't need resetting, so they'd strapped her arm into place against her chest to prevent further injury. It was up to Julius to keep her calm and still when she came round, but he wasn't sure how successful he was going to be. It was obvious that she didn't heal as fast as a vampire, but rumour was that she healed faster than the average human. She'd never been off street patrol for longer than 2 weeks as far as his informants knew. He frowned. She looked so small and helpless lying asleep on his couch, and she felt so fragile that as he helped Jonathan take care of her injuries. He'd only seen her in surveillance photos before tonight. In those she looked proud, self-assured, and utterly capable of ripping someone's heart out without a second thought. She always had her russet hair tied back and a purposeful, arrogant expression on her face, and the ready tension in her body was visible even in those grainy images. And she had taken out Genevieve and Stefan, both vampires over 100 years old, without apparent difficulty. Yet now, lying with her features calm and relaxed, she appeared very young and vulnerable, almost childlike. Her hair had come loose and was framing her face and neck in gentle, moosey waves. In the clear light of his office he could see a sprinkling of freckles across her cheekbones and a dark mark of a bruise slowly spreading across her right jawbone. There was also what appeared to be a burn mark streaked across her left cheek, though this must have happened prior to tonight, as it was still partially covered with makeup. He could sense the pulse of blood through the main artery just below her ear and felt his incisors lengthen instinctively. She smelled utterly delicious. Proof, he thought, that she was far more human than supernatural. He found himself fascinated by her, something he hadn't expected. It had been many years since he'd last found something so captivating, and it startled him. He wanted to know more about her abilities and capabilities, and how exactly she had come by her supernatural talents. Speculation was that she was part vampire, but he knew that was impossible unless she was ingesting vampire blood, and that seemed unlikely. He'd heard many rumours and second-hand accounts of her feats. Not too many first-hand accounts, of course, though he had spoken some with Liam earlier. He knew she worked with animals in her daytime career and wondered how far her control over animals extended, and if she realised that this was a vampire ability. Utterly intriguing. On the whole, he'd never found women particularly interesting. Simone had been one of the exceptions, of course, intriguing him into the point of utter stupidity. Why was he only attracted to the dangerous ones? Death wish? He wasn't sure. He took a deep breath and mentally shook himself out of the old memories. He feverishly hoped he'd made the right decision by approaching her. He'd been unable to dig up the names of any of the so-called High Council of the Malus Ventori. It was much easier for them to hide themselves than it was for the hunters themselves. Thank all that was holy for technology like facial recognition software and a loyal clan member who knew more about computers than Einstein knew about physics. They'd been waiting weeks to get a chance to get at her alone, knowing that two hunters together on patrol would probably fight to the death. They'd been ready to act the moment they could get her on her own. It was pure chance that she and her werewolf friend had turned up tonight in one of his pool clubs, and his barman had recognised her. His informants had confirmed that she was truly off duty and not just on an undercover job. They'd put the operation straight into effect. It had seemed like it would work out so beautifully when they'd been able to separate her from the wolf, and it had, right up to the point that Genevieve had attacked her. He'd selected her to approach for two reasons. Firstly, he had, apparently incorrectly, assumed that she would be the weakest link in the group of hunters. But secondly, and more importantly, he knew from his informants that she had some kind of special link to the SMV Council. They didn't know exactly what the connection was, only that she had a direct line to them, so he was counting on that connection to be able to get things smoothed over enough to convince them of their need to work together with him and his clan. He'd allowed the society to continue to function in his city because it took some of the responsibility of hunting down rogues and miscreants off his hands. Their misguided sense of honour kept them honest enough that they rarely took out anyone who didn't deserve it, and as long as they stayed away from him and his immediate clan members, he saw no reason to put an end to them. Now he was facing a threat that seemed too big for even him to deal with on his own. He was hoping that by combining forces and resources with the SMV, he could prevent outright war. He'd known it was only a matter of time before he was challenged like this, but he hadn't counted on this particular nemesis making new and dangerous friends so quickly. The entire city was going to pay the price if he couldn't find a way to resolve this. He had to get her to listen to him, accept what was coming, and then convince the council to side with him against his rival for control of the city. But first he would have to gain her trust, and that could prove to be far more difficult than the fight itself. She stirred slightly, turning her head away from him and baring her neck invitingly. He almost groaned, closing his eyes and clamping down on his lust for a taste of her. What was wrong with him tonight? He usually had unwavering control over his thirst. He wondered briefly if he needed to find a quick snack before she woke, but it was too late. Her breathing suddenly changed, becoming uneven. She groaned slightly and then went completely still. He could almost follow her thoughts. He could see her body respond the moment she realised she was in strange territory. She became aware of the burning ache down her right side and into her shoulder as the dark mist began to dissipate from her brain. Had she been hit by a bus? She heard herself groan and took a quick breath to steady herself. As the air hit her nostrils, she realised she wasn't in her room at home, or in a hospital, or anywhere else that smelled familiar. She stiffened, instantly on guard. Something wasn't right. She cast out her senses and hit a wall of vampiric power. It all came rushing back to her. Shit. He was here in the room with her, wherever here was. She kept her eyes closed, trying to slow her heartbeat and keep her breathing even, hoping he hadn't yet realised she was conscious. She concentrated on her environment again. It was quiet. She could hear the purr of a computer, his breathing. Huh? So vampires did breathe. Some footsteps and quiet conversations somewhere in the distance behind walls. No immediate danger. The more conscious she became, the more intense the pain seemed to get. Her shoulder was on fire now, her ribs in agony. She clenched her teeth against crying out. She was going to have to move soon to try and relieve the pain, but she wanted a few more minutes to collect herself. His low, husky voice broke into her indecisive thoughts. When you decide to stop pretending you're asleep, I have some painkillers for you, he said with what sounded suspiciously like amusement in his voice. So much for fooling the vampire. She cracked open one eye and then the other, and turned her head towards where she sensed he was. She was in a room which looked incredulously like an office. Since when do vampires have offices? The lights had been dim, so she didn't need to squint while her eyes adjusted. She was lying on a suede-covered chaise lounge with a small pillow tucked under her head and a light blanket covering her. She was surprised to find that she didn't seem to be restrained in any way. She was still wearing her denim pants, but her shirt had been replaced by a man's black silk dress shirt. She could feel her boots still on her feet. Her right arm was in a sling and strapped to her chest. Her ribs were strapped too by the feels of it. Besides that, she couldn't tell much about her own state of health beyond being in minor agony. He was sitting in an office chair behind a desk a few meters away from her. He had his arms folded across his chest, and he was watching her with an intense hooded gaze. He seemed almost expectant. She wondered what he was expecting her to do. To be honest, her instincts were screaming at her to get her back to a wall and a weapon in her hand. Perhaps that was what he was waiting for. Unfortunately, her body was not in any state to be doing anything like that, so she settled for trying to get into a sitting position without sounding like an utter wuss. She slowly swung her legs to the floor and used the momentum to pull herself upright, biting her lower lip to hold back the groan. She was breathing in quick, shallow gusts, but she was upright. Now she felt more ready to face the vampire the rest of them called Sire. The two of them appeared to be alone in the office. He was no less beautiful to look at now than he had been in the dim light of the rooftop earlier. Her eyes definitely hadn't been playing tricks on her in the dark. She briefly and silently celebrated the fact that her vision now seemed to be back to normal. She could see him in clear, sharp focus. The broad expanse of his shoulders seemed even wider in the confines of the office. Not the huge, overly muscular shoulders of bodybuilder, more the toned, athletic look of an Olympic swimmer. The dark blue shirt fitted him snugly, and hinted heavily at the toned muscles sculpting his chest and arms. And while his glorious face remained passive, his dark eyes glittered with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite separate out. She realized now that his eyes were an exquisite shade of sapphire blue, ringed by a halo of aged darkened gold. She'd never seen a more remarkable pair of eyes. She'd previously taken them to be completely black, and she wondered if they changed hues depending on his mood. She'd always thought vampires as cold and vicious. The dead Genevieve was to Gabby the epitome of the vampire race as a whole. There was something smoulderingly passionate about the vampire sitting across from her. His skin was unusually pale, like someone who didn't tan easily, but other than that he seemed, in many ways, almost human, which was actually laughable, as he was the single most powerful vampire that she'd ever encountered. This last thought reminded her that she really needed to get the hell out of here. "You said something about painkillers," she rasped, clearing her throat and swallowing against the dryness in her mouth. If he wanted to kill or torture her, he was going about it in a very unusual manner. Then again, who knew with a vampire? They weren't exactly known for following human norms. He nodded. "The doctor left some tablets for when you came around." He unfolded his arms slowly and leant forward in the chair. "I'll bring them to you. Please stay calm. I'm not going to harm you." He was using the same tone of voice she used when trying to calm a frightened wild animal. "It would be best if you didn't move your arm too much, as our doctor wasn't certain of the full extent of your injuries without x-rays," he said as he rose smoothly at human speed, and turned to the table behind him with a carafe of water and some glasses standing on it. He carefully poured a glass of water and picked up the small bottle from the table. "He suspects a fractured collarbone and some fractured ribs. We've got your shoulder back into place relatively easy, but the wrong movement could pop it out again," he continued as he walked slowly and lethally over with the bottle of tablets and water. He watched her closely, as though expecting her to jump up and run away or leap up and attack him. "Vampires need doctors?" she asked him slightly incredulously. She needed to steer him away from thoughts of her injuries. He must never guess that while she was healing, she was almost as helpless as a full human. That was one of the secrets she held very close to her chest. Only Carl and Byron knew of that weakness. It would prove disastrous if it became common knowledge among the supernatural population, especially the vampires. Fortunately, it only applied to serious injuries, but that was bad enough. He smiled slightly but ignored her question. Instead, he shook out 2 tablets into his palm and held them out to her. "Oxycodone." Jonathan assured me that they were very good for pain relief. I would have to take his word for it, of course, he said with a wiry tilt to his lips. Gabby wasn't quite sure what to make of his odd humour. "Water first, please," she asked. She could be polite when she needed to. She would have been polite to a demon right now if he was holding the painkillers. Well, maybe not even. She took a deep drink. "Make it a double dose." She took another sip of water as he shook out 2 more tablets. "You're resistant to painkillers?" he queried, not seeming to take offence at her demand. She didn't answer him, but handed back the water and took the tablets from his large cold hand, tilting her head back and swallowing them quickly. When she looked at him again, his eyes had gone dark, the deep blue irises almost swallowed by his dilated pupils, the gold halo all but vanished, and his face hungry. She flinched back minutely, and adrenaline surged through her. Before she could move, he abruptly sprang away from her. It was back at the small table without her having seen him move. Freaky vampire, she thought, annoyed. She was instantly on her guard again, searching the room for something to use as a weapon, for the quickest escape route. But when he turned to look back at her a second later, his face and eyes were back to normal. A sardonic smile crossed his face. "My apologies. Again, I didn't mean to startle you. I'm not used to being around humans anymore. Or mostly humans, as the case may be," he added when he saw the protest on her face. "Oh yes. You are far more human than supernatural, my lovely hunter, even with your unnatural resistance to human drugs." A growl rose in her throat. He thought he knew so much about her. "Firstly, I'm not your anything. Secondly, I am anything but lovely, and lastly, what makes you think I am so human?" she demanded testily. He walked 2 steps towards her, a dark predatory look on his face. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. "Oh, your utterly delicious smell gives you away as mostly human. Gabrielle, you smell positively and irresistibly edible." He smiled darkly, making sure that she got a glimpse of his elongated fangs, starkly white and glistening. "Nothing like a flash of fang to remind you that someone is higher up on the food chain than you. But don't worry," he went on conversationally. "I've resisted more delectable morsels than you in the past. I had other plans for you." Gabby was caught on the back foot. No vampire had ever gotten the chance to tell her how edible she smelled, and she found the chill sliver of fear running through her deeply disconcerting. She could hear soft footsteps nearing the office. Her senses told her it was 2 vampires. Julius looked up at the door as the footsteps slowed and stopped. His face suddenly went completely still, and she felt a surge of power flow from him. It tingled over her skin like it was a million electrified butterfly wings. She was expecting the other vampires to open the door, or at least knock, but instead she heard the footsteps hurry back away the way. But instead she just heard the footsteps hurrying back the way they had come. The power rolling off Julius instantly subsided, leaving Gabby feeling like someone had just closed the door on a sandstorm. She looked at him in awe, a stirring of unease building in her stomach. "What the hell are you?" she muttered, more to herself than him. He smiled slightly arrogantly, obviously reveling in his own power. "What do your senses tell you?" he taunted, crossing his arms and leaning back against the desk. "I have it on good authority that you can sense a vampire from miles away. Don't tell me you can't get a read on me." She couldn't take her eyes from his face. It wasn't vampire thrall that was holding her there. "My senses do say vampire," she had said hesitantly. "But they also tell me that you are to the rest of them," she indicated to the rest of the building with a tilt of her chin, "as a tarantula is to a common house spider." His eyebrows lifted quizzically. "And that would be?" He left the sentence hanging. "The same species in principle, but the tarantula is a whole lot bigger, a whole lot scarier, and a whole lot more deadlier than a house spider," she explained. "Ah," he said. "Well then, your senses are quite possibly as good as they say." She once again experienced an almost uncontrollable urge to get the hell out of there. Julius had the ability to seem quite human and responsible one minute, and then remind her forcefully that he was a powerful vampire the next. She was tired and sore and starting to feel a little lightheaded from the painkillers. She wasn't sure she was up for any kind of altercation with him, either verbally or physical. By the number of vampires in the immediate vicinity, she knew they were in some kind of vampire stronghold. Fighting her way out probably wasn't a viable option. She was just going to have to talk her way out of this one. A single set of footsteps approached the door now. "Enter," Julius said without raising his voice, and without looking at the door. He was still looking at Gabby when a slim female vampire entered the office, carrying a small tray. The smell hit Gabby instantly, and if it wasn't for the broken ribs, she would have sighed when she caught the whiff of fresh coffee. Double shot caramel latte with extra cream, her instant cure for all ills. and in the bag she could smell a baked apple Danish. Her mouth was already watering. Julius moved towards the other vamp and relieved her of the tray. "That'll be all, Claudia. Make sure we are not disturbed again," he said in a tone that brokered no argument. "Of course, sire. I'll be nearby should you need anything further," she replied with her head slightly bowed. Then she turned and was gone, closing the door behind her soundlessly. Julius picked up a small side table and placed it close to Gabby's left hand, placing the tray on it. "I took the liberty of ordering you some refreshments. I hope we have your preferences correct," he said. "You've done your homework, Jules," she drawled, watching his eyes flash with an annoyance at a shortening of his name. There was just something about poking dragons with sticks that she couldn't resist, no matter how dangerous she knew the dragon to be. "I trust if you were going to drug me again, you'd have just used the dart gun like last time." "You're starting to sound like an attractive prospect," he retorted, but then caught himself and took a calm breath. "The food and coffee have nothing added to them. I would offer to sample them myself, but as human drugs have no effect on us, it would prove nothing. Please trust me in this case, they are perfectly safe." Gabby couldn't possibly resist the smell a moment longer. She picked up the coffee, trying to hide the slight trembling of her hands, and took a long sip, closing her eyes and reveling in the sweet aromatic taste as it washed down her throat. It was still hot and made exactly as she liked it. Then she set the cup aside and dug into the pastry bag, pulling out a warm, crusty pastry. She tried to take small, dainty bites, wanting to devour it in 2 mouthfuls. Byron didn't have any sound theories on why she craved so much sugar, so the simplest answer was to indulge in it as often as possible. Not even Carl could keep up with her when it came to sweet treats. Julius leaned back in the desk, watching her in utter fascination. It had obviously been a while since he watched a human eat, or at least she hoped that was the reason for the fascination. She brushed a few crumbs from her lips and washed the first pastry down with more coffee. So far, vamp hospitality was better than she had expected. Her hands were steady now and the painkillers had kicked in. It's time to get this meeting underway. "Now perhaps you'd like to explain what exactly I'm doing here," she said, pulling a second Danish out of the bag. Julius took a deep breath and folded his arms. "I believe that you're aware of an increase in the number of demons entering the city recently." She looked up sharply at him. As far as everyone at the S&V knew, there was no association between demons and vampires, but in truth they didn't know very much about vampire society in general. "Yes, there's been an increase in demon activity recently," she said around a mouthful of pastry. "What do you have to do with it?" "I would like to say I have nothing to do with the increase," Julius said tightly. "But I would be kidding myself if I did." He pushed away from the desk and began pacing up and down the length of the room in front of the heavily stocked floor-to-ceiling bookcase. He reminded her of a racehorse walking the ring before a race. He was trying to contain his movements, trying to rein himself in, but his desire to move and let rip was oozing through his tight self-control. "How much do you know about the way vampire clans are run? How our hierarchy works?" "To be honest, not much," she replied. "My experience is that there are vampires that try to blend in and feed themselves without resorting to terror and violence, and there are other vampires that revel in the horror of attacking and killing humans to feed. The former I ignore and the latter I kill. There aren't too many hand guides out there explaining the intricacies of vampire life," she quipped. "I guess that's true. We are secretive by nature and by necessity. But I would have thought that the esteemed Societas Malus Fantori would have gathered more intelligence on the supernaturals that they hunt." She raised a sceptical eyebrow. "Are you actually trying to tell me that you would prefer us to know more about you?" she asked dubiously. He let out a low growl. "No, that's not my preference, but it would take far less time to explain our situation now if you had some background information. What's currently happening in the city is intricately linked with the hierarchy within the vampire clans." "You mean the increase of demon activity has something to do with the vampire politics?" she asked, somewhat bewildered. "In a nutshell, yes," he replied. "But it is also far more complex than that. I think a short history lesson in vampire politics would help you understand my current position. Will you bear with me while I try and make this clear for you? You should also understand that this would be a large show of faith on my part, as we keep this kind of information secret in order to protect ourselves. There are those of my kind who would kill you simply for having this knowledge that I am about to give you." You would need to accept that threat to your own safety and to anyone else you impart this knowledge to in the future. You mean you're not going to swear me to some kind of vampiric code of silence? He looked at her with a be serious expression on his face. No. There is no vampire code of silence. If you agree to what I'll be asking of you, you will need to impart this knowledge to some of those on the council in order to gain their support. I just want to be sure that you know the danger you are putting yourself and others in when you are party to this information. Both of her eyebrows rose incredulously now. Well, there. Let's back up a few steps. I'm not sure I want to be the proverbial messenger who takes the bullet for your political agenda, Sire Jules. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. She remembered that same expression on the faces of some of her school teachers. Will you just listen to me for a few minutes, please? I'm not going to ask you to make any rash decisions now. I just want you to have all the information you need to make a rational choice. I don't expect you to make that decision on your own. There is a war coming, and the Manus Ventori will need to choose a side if they want to keep down the number of human victims in the war. She looked at him in silence for a few seconds, then she sighed and nodded. All right, I'll listen. I'll even try to keep an open mind. Then she added, but you better rustle up some more coffee if you want me coherent. A slight smile lifted one corner of his mouth as she felt the surge of power. Your wish? My command. He only said it slightly sarcastically.